All right, everybody, now we begin with Chapter 10, Pure Monopoly. So here we are going to the opposite end of the spectrum. So before we were at pure competition, which I think we all know that pure competition is over here. It's theoretical. And at the other end, you have the pure monopoly, also theoretical. This whole chapter is really important, so make sure you do a good job reading. All right, so in a pure monopoly situation, what we have is a single seller. So they are the only producer. There are no close substitutes. They are a price maker. We heard about what price takers we had in pure competition, but they're the price maker, meaning that they have control over the price. There are very strong barriers to entry. And then in terms of non-price competition, meaning what do they compete on if not price? What we see that is that firms do what, PR work, basically just public relations. Or sometimes they advertise the product so because if we don't know that it exists, then we could never buy it. But think about Ameren UE. Why do they advertise? We all buy our electricity from Ameren, but they buy it so that we have good feelings about them. That way, when they need to go to Congress to ask for rate hikes or something, we're a little bit more likely, to sway our voted representatives to be generous to them. But at the end of the day, they're not doing it to make you buy more electricity. Typically, anyway. So we have some examples of monopolies, and this is a little bit tricky because they're not so much pure monopolies because these public utilities are regulated, right? And then we have these are actually kind of outdated sorts of examples. But professional sports teams, those actually might be pretty decent examples. So, you can look at examples like the Cleveland Browns, who have been terrible forever, and yet they're horrifically profitable, right? Why are the Browns so profitable? Well, it's because of the monopoly status of the NFL. It certainly is not because they make good decisions drafting quarterbacks. So we're going to first off talk about barriers to entry. So remember that a barrier is any factor that keeps firms from entering the industry. Some of those can be legal. They can be obvious, right? There's patents and there's licenses. So in this case, the law actually protects people from coming in. Then there's ownership of essential resources. So if I have the mine that has all of the nickel, and I own that mine, there's no nickel anywhere else on earth, then I have an essential monopoly because I own everything. And then there's pricing. So you can give yourself a monopoly if you can figure out a way to charge such a low price that nobody else can compete with you. Now, of course, that at least appears in the beginning to be pretty good for consumers because that price is getting so low. The last one I'm going to talk about is actually the first one listed, and that is economies of scale. So in this situation, and we've kind of talked about this, if you have a long-run average total cost curve that basically just keeps going down, 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 then what that means is that one very large firm could produce at a lower cost than several very small firms. So this is what we usually call a natural monopoly. So here's their drawing. So in this example, we've got 50 people, or I'm sorry, one firm producing 50 and it costs $20. This firm producing 100 and it costs 15. So if we get our 50, so if 100 is how much we need to make, then we can do 50 times 20, right, which is 1,000, and then we can multiply that for 2,000, or we can do 100 times 15 for 1,500. So the cost is actually lower by having one firm do it rather than two. And that's how economies of scale can become a barrier to entry. And now you see even further, we get all the way down here, and we get even lower. Okay, so we're producing twice as much, 200 units rather than 100. So you go back, crunch the numbers, and you'll see how much less expensive it is. Okay, so the pure monopolist is the industry. So in this example, that's kind of the thing. The demand curve of the individual monopolist is the same as the market demand curve. So in a purely competitive market, we had our firm and our market. We had two separate graphs, right? So this one's supply demand, And then here we have this guy, right? Sorry, excuse me there. So this is what we saw in pure competition, okay? But obviously in this example, what we're going to see, so this is pure competition, and what we're going to see now is we have one firm with a downsloping demand curve, another more steeply downsloping marginal revenue curve, a marginal cost curve, and an average total cost curve. Now this is still going to intersect at the lowest point. There we go. And what we're going to see is the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost will once again dictate our Q. Then we have the vertical distance between price, which is dictated by the demand curve, and average total cost right here. That becomes our total profit. This is per unit profit, the vertical distance. This is total profit, the area. All right, so you can look through this, and this basically is just going to see what we've seen before. So we get all of our little columns, output, average revenue, total revenue, marginal revenue, etc. And here's kind of where you need to focus. Notice that marginal revenue is going down. Okay, we'll get to that in a little bit. So in a monopoly, we're going to assume that all customers pay the same price. Okay, so if we want to get more people to buy our product, we have to lower the price. Okay, so at price, what this downsloping demand curve means is at the price of $142, I'm going to sell quantity 3. But if I want to sell 4, the only way I'm going to do that is by lowering the price. Okay, so that means that I sell 1 additional unit and I earn this much additional revenue. However, what it also means is now instead of selling for $142, I'm selling for $132. So I lose $10 per unit because I don't just lower the price of the 4th unit, I lower the price of all 3 previous units as well. Because that's the way it works when we are assuming that all customers pay the same price. Because we can't effectively segment our business. But as long as the amount of money that I lose by lowering the price on the final item and all the previous ones is outweighed by the extra revenue I get by selling that extra unit, then I'm still ahead of the game. Now what we see is our marginal revenue curve. So our marginal revenue curve is always below the demand curve, and it always falls faster than the demand curve because the marginal revenue is the additional revenue earned when you sell an additional unit. But since we're selling the additional unit for less than we sold the previous unit, our marginal revenue needs to fall. Additionally, it's not only the last unit that we're selling at a lower price, it's all of the previous units that we're selling at a lower price. So that's why we have this more steeply downsloping marginal revenue curve. You probably want to read the book's section on marginal revenue in a downsloping demand curve situation because it's really, really important. We'll talk about it in class as well, but you really got to understand that. So we know that marginal revenue is less than price. We know that monopolists are price makers, and we know that the monopolist sets the price in the elastic region of the demand curve. That should be no surprise. We remember that from our total revenue test. Here's what it looks like. All right, so when marginal revenue is 0, we know that total revenue peaks. We remember this, okay? And we know that marginal revenue is going to fall faster than demand. While marginal revenue is positive, that means that you're in the elastic region because this positive marginal revenue means that total revenue is rising. Total revenue is rising. Okay, now this was told with, and I'm going to add this in, remember how we had our total cost curve, right? So when we had total cost, this is what I was saying, that no business would ever operate over here, where by selling more, your total revenue goes down. This is the inelastic region of the demand curve. Nobody would ever exist there. It just doesn't make any sense. This is our total cost curve, so we know that we're actually going to be producing at the greatest vertical distance, right? So maybe it's there in this particular cost curve. What we're also going to see is that once we add in our marginal cost curve, right, here, marginal cost is going to tell us our Q. Now, imagine this lines up a little bit better if my artistry is better. So this tells us quantity, but it doesn't tell us price. Instead, we continue our dotted line up. That gives us price. Okay, so that's what we're seeing there. That's how we're going to use this. But do keep in mind, because it's a common question, about everybody producing in the elastic region, not producing over here in the inelastic region. So here are your price and output determinations. These are the rules. This is how you do it. And for those of you who are struggling, follow these steps. Step 1, determine the output by finding MR equals MC. That's your tattoo. Then you extend a vertical line upward from the output that you determined in step 1 to get the pure monopolist's price. Okay, and that's going to give you your price. So you determine profit then by taking the per unit profit and subtracting average total. Find profit per unit by subtracting average total cost at the output from the profit maximizing price, which is what you get at that vertical line's intersection with the demand curve. Then multiply by Q, okay? Or you can find total cost by multiplying average total cost by Q and get total revenue multiplied and then subtract the two. So you can do either one, but follow these rules, okay? And you'll have to do both for different questions depending on what kind of information you're given. So a lot of people assume that monopolists charge whatever they want. But that's not the case. They don't charge whatever they want. They are concerned with profit. And they can lose money. So they will do whatever it is in their best profit interest. And we always know that profit is maximized and loss is minimized, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That is where a monopoly will produce all the time. Then we average in average variable cost. We get in average total cost. Now, since this tells us where we're going to produce, we know this is our Q, so we draw our dotted line down and our dotted line up. We then take the difference between price at this quantity and average total cost at this quantity. In this situation, are we earning a profit? We are not. Instead, we're earning a loss, and the loss is this much. Now we'll see. Step 1, that's your price. There we go. That's the area of loss. So price is determined here. Total cost is determined here. And that gives you the area of loss. So let's look at the economic effects of a monopoly. So in a purely competitive market, you know that price equals marginal cost, which equals minimum average total cost, productive and allocative efficiency. Over here, though, all of a sudden, we're producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost as well, but this different downsloping demand curve, downsloping marginal revenue curve that slopes downward more steeply than the full demand curve gives us this higher price. Okay, so we get a lower quantity and a higher price. So let's circle that. We get a lower quantity and a higher price than we would get in a purely competitive market. That's the inefficiency that a monopoly gives us. Now, what winds up happening is you get an income transfer. Some income that could stay with consumers goes to the owners, right? There are some cost complications, though. So this is the good part from a monopoly's perspective and a bad part from the consumer's perspective. Now, costs can be complicated. So we already talked about how economies of scale might make having monopolies make sense. We call those natural monopolies. So economies of scale might make monopolies a good thing if they can, because of economies of scale, deliver their services cheaper and more effectively. However, there's this thing called X-Inefficiency, which we'll get to on the next graph. And then there are rent-seeking expenditures. So this is when a government, say, grants a monopoly, okay, and then the business has to spend a bunch of time and money lobbying in order to keep that monopoly. That's what we call rent-seeking behavior or rent-seeking expenditures. And then there's also technological advance. Now, sometimes a monopoly might do a really good job, so it can be good or it can be bad. They might seek technological advance in order to decrease their costs, which allows them to be more profitable. Or they might get lazy. If they don't have competition and they don't seek technological advance, then we can wind up with the monopoly causing us sort of a junky product. But let's get back to this idea of X-inefficiency. We have always assumed that a business produces on its average total cost curve. But of course, it doesn't have to, okay? And that's an important thing. So we always say, well, here's the average total cost curve, so you're here, and then you've got your demand curve, right? So if your demand curve comes down here and your marginal revenue curve is there, right? So we would say, well, we just go right here, that's our price, here's our cost, so, this makes profit. But it is entirely possible that we could just be inefficient. We could have a whole bunch of lazy workers that don't do a good job. Or we could have a executive team that has a whole bunch of extra private jets that they fly around just to entertain themselves. They could be all sorts of inefficient. And that's what we call X-inefficiency because there's no reason for it. It just is. What competition typically does is force everybody down onto the average total cost curve. Right? So this means that you might not be at the minimum average total cost, but at least for this particular quantity, you are producing it as cheaply as possible. Okay, but of course sometimes we're up here. Apologies to anybody whose family worked at the old Anheuser-Busch, but this is why Anheuser-Busch was taken over. They were not doing a very good job being on their low average total cost curve. They had their fancy parties and all their corporate jets and all that jazz. So what their buyer did was came in and said, look, we can take the cost curve and we can push it right down there. And that will take Anheuser-Busch's profit, which was right here, and make it this whole area here. So that's why InBev could afford to buy Anheuser-Busch. All right, now what do you do when there are monopolies? There's kind of three things. You can break it up through using antitrust laws. This was big, in the Teddy Roosevelt era. You can regulate it like we have with the monopolies. This usually makes sense when you have what's called a natural monopoly. The natural monopoly is, kind of a good thing. Or you can ignore it. And this is what we saw with the whole Windows Microsoft monopoly. Okay, we didn't do anything about it. Nobody really tried to break them up or say that they weren't doing anything right. But what wound up happening is a whole bunch of iPhones and cloud computing and tablets and all that jazz. Nobody tries to compete with Windows. You just try to do something different. You let the market get rid of the monopoly. So they still have an effective monopoly with Windows on PCs. But of course, now we don't care very much about PCs. We care about tablets and cell phones and all that kind of jazz. You could argue that if we had broken Microsoft up, or regulated them and made things less expensive, maybe we wouldn't have cell phones, maybe we wouldn't have tablets, because Apple wouldn't have needed to come up with the iPad in order to invent a whole new way of producing computing power. We can kind of skip through this. Price discrimination is this idea of making sure that you can charge different buyers different prices. It's relatively rare, but you can do it. Price differences are not based on cost differences. In order for it to work, you have to be able to segregate your segregate your market, and you have to be able to stop reselling, which is not necessarily easy. Here's some examples, but you can go back and look at this, and we'll talk about it as well in class. So in this situation, what we have here are two different demand curves. Okay, so this is the demand curve for small businesses buying stuff. This is the demand curve for students. And normally students wouldn't ever buy this at all, right? Because they can't afford it if it's way up here at this high price. But if you can correctly segment your market by saying, look, show me your student ID and I'll sell it to you for a lower price. If you don't have a student ID, you got to pay the higher price. Then they get this green area of profit plus this green area of profit. Good thing for them. Okay, natural monopolies is where we will pause here for the time being.